Good morning. I've got into trouble from Kev Human, who says, "What do you mean there are not many non-Jewish Zionists? What about Christian evangelists? There are millions of them." For someone so worldly and well-travelled, Tim, you often seem rather ill-informed or perhaps blinkered. I hope blinkered, possibly. I'm not a great fan of Pat Robertson or what's the Falwell man? I can't remember his name. And a lot of the ideas of Christian evangelical Zionism start with people like Billy Graham, though there is an argument and there is a claim that Martin Luther King was also sympathetic to Zionism, to the idea of of Jews finding a new homeland in Israel. This this is essentially a part of a millennium Protestant tradition, often called Restorationism. Millennianism, that is a belief that the end of days is near, has dogged Christianity, uh, well, twice really. Once as the first millennium passed, a huge burst of millennial beliefs, all identified as heresies. Perhaps the most famous one was the Cathars, which led to the Albigensian Crusade and so on. And then more recently with the second millennium, but that goes back really to the 19th century. The beginning of the 19th century there was a wave of millennianism, and much of this was fired by an evangelical reading of texts, particularly from Ezekiel and the Book of Revelations. So if you go, so that's the Protestant evangelical thing, and it gets quite vocal in America. But if you go back to the development of Jewish Zionism, that could possibly go back as far as 1800. But we certainly know that when Herzl was arguing for a new Jewish state, he visited Pope Pius X in 1904. Pope Pius took a very dim view of the idea, and Herzl apparently explained that the establishment of the State of Israel was not a religious statement, and that seemed to satisfy the Pope. Nevertheless, the Catholic Church, the largest Christian church, has never embraced that sort of millennial Protestant fervour, which you can find quite often in America. I think even then it's sympathy, not advocacy or active engagement, except in a very, very small group of individuals. If you go to Judaism, if you go to Israel, you will often find people walking around with placards saying Zionism is not Judaism, anti-Zionism is not anti-Semitic. Zionism and Judaism are two distinct terms, and very often, but particularly on marches on Saturdays, one of which is coming up now, you find those two terms interchanged and confused. The idea of Israeli is confused with the idea of being Jewish. There is the principle of the right of return, but there are also many non-Jewish Israelis. So Judaism is a religion which has evolved over millennia, whereas Zionism is a modern invention. Even if you take the evangelical Zionism, even if you see elements of millennial Zionism going back to the beginnings of the Protestant tradition, and some people would argue that it does, it's still modern. It's still something that's developed over the last 400 years. That's a drop in the ocean compared to the development of Judaism, which is 4,000 years old at least. And yeah, I concede it. Modern Zionism has attracted and attracts a good deal of modern evangelical support, but I think very little of that is practical. It means there's a good deal of pressure to support Israel in the United States, not just from the Jewish community, but also from the evangelical community. But in terms of practical support, other than the political pressure, I don't think there's a great deal. What is Judaism? And I thought about this for a while. I mean, I used to teach religious studies and PHSE and so on, and it was always an interesting angle. What is Judaism? What is Christianity? What is Islam? How do you sum them up quickly? And looking at the textbooks, they were very poor and remain very poor. In fact, I was so impressed by Lewis's performance in the House of Commons the other day that I think probably it is time to start writing textbooks, or perhaps simply producing material that can be used in schools. But Judaism is belief, at its heart, Judaism is belief in one God. And whether this is henotheism or monotheism, whether this is one God and there are no others, or one God who is greater than any others, or one God who is identified in that particular way by Judaism, there are varieties of understanding of that. But the following of the one God, and I mean avoiding the term worship because that's a particular Anglican trope which is imposed on a lot of comparative religious teaching. Judaism is anchored in a set of practices and rituals, observing Shabbos, Kashrut, Bris Milah, giving tzedakah, celebrating events in the calendar, through the family, and then the wider community, entering the wider community through bar mitzvah, bas mitzvah, and the idea of the community prayer being greater than individual prayer through the minyan, through the synagogue, which is not a building but a gathering of adult men or women in the more liberal traditions. So it divides into orthodox from ultra-orthodox, reform and liberal interpretations. It's a religious tradition which is diverse, and it's a tradition which isn't exclusively religious. It's certainly possible to be an atheist Jew. And that brings on to the Zionist thing. So I think opposing Zionism is different to religious prejudice. Opposing Zionism is not necessarily religious prejudice, but I think there is I think there's a difference between opposing the political creed of Zionism and opposing the reality of the state of Israel, which is a Jewish refuge, and opposing the state of Israel, opposing the reality of the state of Israel, wishing ill on or the destruction of the state of Israel. I think that is an anti-Semitic trope. Even if the former, even if opposing Zionism may not necessarily or always be. I think I think there needs to be a healthy debate about the actions and activities, the actions and intentions of the current Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu. I think that's a sort of debate that can go on about any political leader. And I don't think that's fundamentally anti-Semitic. But I think as Kev Human says, there's there are a lot of people involved, a lot of adherents to different traditions, but it still comes down to this question of is it anti-Semitic to be anti-Zionist? Not necessarily, but it can be. And but equally, I think it's important to try and distinguish between the two. And despite Kev Human's rather firm rebuke, I really don't think that Christian Zionism has a serious practical implication for the state of Israel, except for the support that can be assumed from America because of the volume of the evangelical Christian support in America. But as I say, I don't think it's practical. I think it's vocal, not practical. I hope that answers the question. I had such a sleepless night. I don't think it was because of that. I just had a sleepless night.